Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I almost let 2 kick-ass shooters escape my attention. May my soul forever be saved from the temptations of the modern military shooter. Praise Gaben. The Forgive Me, Father duology are games that speak to me. Their striking visual aesthetic originally brought them to my attention, but the superb gameplay on display had me craving to chip away at my sanity. As a result, both games have been on my radar for some time now. So when developer Bytebarrel reached out to see if I wanted copies, I couldn't refuse. On that note, please be aware that I received these games for free, and as such, my opinion may be annoyingly biased. With that out of the way, let's get into the usual contextual summary before diving into the game itself. Bytebarrel was formed in 2017 by Ernest Christian and Camille, two Poles who share a love for the first-person shooter. 4 years after founding, Forgive Me, Father would be dropped onto Steam and GOG, developed by a total of 10 people. A brief detour was had to make Mythbusters the Game Crazy Experiment Simulator? What the fuck? No, I can't go down the rabbit hole. Ignore it. Ignore it. On October 19th, 2023, Forgive Me, Father 2 was launched into early access with the first act and a half ready to play. It would receive consistent updates throughout the year before fully launching on October 24th, 2024. Something about seeing this game get out the door in little over a year of early access gives me some small hope for that system. It turns out your game doesn't need to be in early access for 12 years. Forgive Me, Father 2 would launch with a full 5 acts, developed by a total of 17 people and 1 production baby on the side. Of note is that 7 of the developers of the first game would work on the second in some capacity. Look at that. Institutional knowledge being built before my eyes. Microsoft could learn a thing or two here. In the interest of time, I'm glossing over Forgive Me, Father 2's devlogs, but I encourage you to seek them out on the Steam page. You will have to scroll a bit to get to the beginning, but they are a treasure trove of data for those wanting to know about how the second game was made. Visually, these games are stunning to look at as they combine 2D sprites and 3D models in an almost perfect blend. Enemies, characters, items, and destructible objects are typically sprites, while environmental objects exist as proper models. Very reminiscent of old build engine games. I will say that it seems like there were far more 3D objects in the second game than the first. Their increased usage did give the environments a more grounded feel, like this could actually be a place and not just a video game fight room. In any case, you'll never be bored at looking at these games. Environments are incredibly varied. You may have the progression from a hotel to the wider city beyond in one game, or a series of World War I battlefields in another. Not to mention when your perceptions of reality begin to break down. I do love the creature designs a lot. Your standard issue Dagon-loving cultists are here, but unique enemies like zombies that hold replacement heads lurk about too. The enemies of Forgive Me, Father 2 are much more animated than their counterparts in Forgive Me, Father 1. But there's also something about the overall designs in 1 that I personally like more. Perhaps it is because they look a touch more stylized and my brain enjoys a cartoony Lovecraft aesthetic. Weapons are also notable in their visual design. In both games you can pick between more standard weaponry or those that have been blessed by the old gods. That second category of weapon is usually some twisted combination of man-made and organic materials. Furthermore, these weapons have super interesting characteristics. Like a shotgun whose bullets bounce around on screen until they hit an enemy. Which leads me into how visual readability can be mixed. Enemy projectiles will always be brightly colored to allow for quick threat identification. But the sheer number of projectiles can be distracting at times, especially when your own are added to the mix. Both games also have a madness mechanic that affects your vision. I'll go into greater detail in the gameplay section, but for now, they can be a problem when trying to get a clear picture of a fight, even if thematically appropriate. It can be turned off in the settings, but it's on by default, so in my mind, that is the intended experience. Something of note as well is the difference in lighting between the two games. Forgive Me, Father 2 is significantly darker than its predecessor. This is partly by design. The first game featured some dark areas that could be navigated with a lantern, only this would cause you to put away your weapon. Someone thought it would be a better idea to have a proper flashlight in the second game so you could fight in the dark. Only they decided it should be a wind-up flashlight so you'll be constantly recharging the thing. It can be both annoying and deadly. I would have taken a torch I could swing at enemies over the options I received. Sound is an area where these games can excel. Tim Fialka created soundtracks that can both set a mood and get your blood pumping. Like seriously, take a listen. I'm not sure which of these soundtracks I enjoy more, especially since my favorite song is a tie between Big Ugly Fish from 1 and Icebreaker from 2. Monsters have distinct audio cues that are very useful for keeping track of what you are fighting or what may be coming up, especially when the visual readability can get hazy. Additionally, there will usually be some kind of church bell ringing when enemies respond, something that I found to be very useful in the middle of a fight. The voice acting is something of a surprise, as I had assumed that these games were going to be mostly silent, but our main character is commenting on the madness around them. I'm just not a huge fan of the priest's voice.
More otherworldly demons. Dormant evil wakes up at night.
The vocal performance is a little bit lacking in my opinion. And I know Jeffrey Rude can do good line reads, as evidenced by the priest's dark conscience in the second game.
Your soul was fighting with nightmares, while your body was locked in a cell to protect the world from darkness. Darkness residing in your heart.
Meaning this was a creative decision, and one I'm not a huge fan of in the end. At least the narrator from the first game is absolutely fantastic.
He asked for your help. He asked for your arrival. Chaotic contents of the letter. Missing people, panic, strange voices. Cousin Lewis' request for help could not remain unanswered.
Alright, I've dragged my feet enough. I have to talk about the weapon sounds. They are mixed. Some of these weapons sound appropriately devastating to use in one game, but in another they sound unbelievably weak. Listen to what they did to my Abyssal Shotgun. And there's no consistency. The revolver of 2 sounds better than 1, the default rifle of 1 sounds better than 2, the explosive weapons of 2 sound better than 1, etc, etc, etc. I could go on, but you get the picture. Some weapons were not created equal. That sentiment carries over to the gameplay. Both games feature a fine selection of weaponry. I can't do the usual name them all bit. There are simply too many weapons. Plus, you can't even use all of them at the same time. At least nothing feels underpowered to use. More like the weapons are tailored to a specific preference or play style. What is interesting is how you earn these weapons is different in each game. You will acquire the base weapon by picking it up in game, but in Forgive Me Father 1, these weapons and your character can be upgraded through an RPG leveling system. The more enemies you dome, the more XP you earn, the more powerful weapons and abilities you can use. Though some upgrades are mutually exclusive with others. Completing acts will give you respec points that can be used to adjust your abilities to the current situation if needed. A fairly straightforward system compared to Forgive Me Father 2. Here you have to find crystals in-game to afford weapon upgrades. The total number of weapons you can use at one time is fewer, but there's also significantly more variation between these weapons when compared to the last game. For example, the revolver can be turned into a semi-auto pistol, an Eldritch miniature shotgun, or Cthulhu Uzi. And unlike the previous game where you could change things on the fly, Forgive Me Father 2 features a central hub world where you can change weapons, abilities, play some axe ball, and have a chance to replay completed levels. Which now brings me to the madness mechanics and the various special abilities to use. In the first game, the more damage you do to enemies, the more your madness meter goes up. This causes the damage you deal to increase while damage taken decreases, with the aforementioned downside that your screen becomes harder to visually read. Additionally, you have 4 different abilities whose use is recharged every 25 madness points. These include a heal, stun, infinite ammo, and invulnerability. Frankly, I used healing and invulnerability more than the other 2 simply because they kept me alive during fights. On the flip side is the ability system of Forgive Me Father 2, a much more freeform system where you can pick between 3 different cards. These cards are split between active and passive abilities. Active abilities will only trigger once you read from the Dark Tome. Usage of this tome is dictated by the green bar at the bottom of your screen, allowing you to store up to 4 charges. My biggest issue with the system in 2 is that I didn't feel a need to experiment around. Which is a shame because some of these abilities seem really cool from their description. But in first-person shooter games, I'm far more concerned with staying alive in a fight. With only 3 card slots, I dedicated 2 to passive abilities for more ammo capacity and increased healing from all sources. My one active ability was to leech health from enemies I damaged, which was supercharged by the passive increased healing ability. I can't help but feel that if there was just 1 more card slot, I would have been able to really experiment around with the system rather than optimize the fun out of it. There is also a journalist character from the first game with different abilities than the priest, but I really can't comment on her. The story follows the priest, so I figured it would be best to play the same character across both games.
Ain't nothing like a phone game.
Something I was astonished by was how different the movement is between games. In Forgive Me Father 1, you'll feel like a cross between an F-35 and an AE-86 strafing around enemies. Combine that with a responsive bunny hop, and you are feeling like a Quake successor. Contrast that with the slower, more precise movement of Forgive Me Father 2. It's tickling that part of my brain where I keep my memories of early to mid-2000s shooters locked away. Both styles of movement perfectly fit their games, but it is still surprising how different these games are from one another in this minor aspect. I usually don't touch on this, but the level design of both games are worth talking about, especially with how drastically different the two games can feel because of their pacing. Very few levels in Forgive Me Father 1 were over 10 minutes long. As a result, you felt like you were making rapid progress through that game. Comparatively, in Forgive Me Father 2, there were 3 levels total that were under 10 minutes if you exclude the bosses. This ended up causing the second game to feel a little prolonged even though it has fewer levels than the first game. Which is a shame because I enjoyed the overall level design of Forgive Me Father 2 much more. It takes advantage of the verticality the new jump provides to encourage exploration. I just wish the average length of those levels was just a little bit shorter. Both games prominently feature key hunting as a core mechanic, and thankfully it never feels like a chore. Unfortunately, the switch hunting in Forgive Me Father 2 is the exact opposite. My least favorite level in the game is a massive switch hunt through the ruins of an Egyptian temple. You have to find 23 switches in total, inside a claustrophobic maze. I personally pride myself on my ability to create a somewhat accurate mental map. Part of why I love the Dark Souls series is because there is no map and you have to actually remember the locations of various routes and shortcuts. But I got lost in this temple because the routes through it constantly intertwined with one another. It really feels like this level exists to pad the game's length. There is no other reason to have a map where you have to find 23 switches in a maze. It is absolutely the worst map in either of these games, and I despise it with all my being. On a brighter note, these games' boss fights are worth mentioning. The fights from the first game are pretty straightforward with some occasional trickery involved. Just shoot the big massive fish and tentacles to win. Although Act 4's boss is probably my favorite due to how hectic that fight felt in the moment. The second game removes boss health to increase uncertainty and emphasizes dodging with larger, almost rhythmically based projectiles. My favorite boss in Forgive Me Father 2 is chasing some freakazoid down an infinite corridor as he shoots projectiles and conjures walls to push you into the laser wall that is steadily catching up to you during the fight. The more damaged the boss is, the faster and more complicated these walls become. I got so into this fight that when my character was just dodging back and forth rapidly between walls, I was actively moving my body as well. Taking damage caused me to remember that I'm supposed to be shooting this man. All that being said, I do want to emphasize that I was often enjoying the moment-to-moment gameplay. Shooting Lovecraft horrors in the face with eldritch nightmares is in fact fun. Shocking, I know. It was only during certain situations and levels that I found myself being annoyed or frustrated. I think the overall package is very solid, especially when compared to other games I've played on this channel. The story of the Forgive Me Father duology is pretty straightforward, following a descent into and then rise from madness. Forgive Me Father 2 does have multiple endings, but it boils down to a series of binary choices made after boss fights. There's bits and pieces of lore scattered throughout both games, however it only ever felt like window dressing to me. Almost none of the knowledge I gained held substantial meaning beyond alluding to future levels. I don't even know the name of our main character beyond his occupation. Overall, I'm a bit disappointed but unsurprised. It's a boomer shooter. I would much rather the developers focus on making the game fun to play and worry about the story justifications later. At the end of the day, these games are two very different animals despite sharing the same name. They both have fantastic aesthetics, but also their own unique caveats. It is undoubtable to me that your average player will end up liking one of these games more than the other due to this nature. Personally, I think I'm in the camp that prefers 1 over 2, but I can still heartily recommend 2 to those who may prefer something with a more deliberate pace. And I think most boom shooting enthusiasts will enjoy a playthrough of both games if they're willing to give it a try. You can find Forgive Me Father 1 and 2 for $19.99 and $24.99 respectively on Steam and GOG. Now it's time for me to descend beneath the waves from whence I came. back to that shining city under the sea. Thanks for watching. More garbage to come. $80, huh?